Hello everyone. Today, our group will be presenting our report titled Feeding the Future: Data Science Perspectives on Global Nutrition and Happiness. My name is Surbi, and these are my group mates, Alina, Naili, Lokaf, and Kwan. So first, let's start off with question 16. Do countries with higher average protein or fat intake during winter months tend to report higher happiness? So let's look at our approach and findings. We defined winter as December, January, and February, and compared average intake with happiness scores across countries. The data shows a clear pattern across with the higher winter protein and fat intake, and generally reporting higher happiness. This suggests a positive link between nutrition and happiness. Next, I'll pass my time.
Brazil has a lower average winter intake compared to Japan, yet it shows a higher happiness score. This tells us that happiness is not determined solely by winter food intake. Other factors such as climate, culture, lifestyle also plays an important role. It's also important to keep in mind that seasonal patterns vary between countries. Brazil, for instance, experiences winter from June to August, not from December to February. So the average food intake recorded during December to February may naturally be lower. Similarly, India only experienced winter in certain northern regions, while much of the country remains warm throughout the year. These climatic differences help explain why food intake varies across country and should be considered when interpreting the result. In addition, India's significantly lower average winter intake can also be linked to its lower GDP per capita. Lower income levels in some parts of the population may limit access to food, reducing overall consumption and influencing the dietary patterns we observe in the data. Overall, the analysis shows that multiple factors contribute to countries' general happiness score. While there may be general correlation between higher winter food intake and happiness, food consumption alone does not determine happiness. Climate, seasonal differences, cultural lifestyle, and economic conditions all interact to shape the overall well-being of a population. Now I'll pass my time over to the next person.
Okay, thank you. So now question 17. Do long-term fat intake trends from 1961 to 2020 correlate with happiness? Okay, so for this question, we use the daily intake data set. We filtered the data from 1961 to 2020 and calculated each country's average daily fat intake. From the happiness data set, we extracted each country's average happiness score. We then joined these data sets by country name and plotted a scatter plot to visualize the relationship. Now I'll be passing my time over to the next person.
From the scatter plot, we can already notice a clear pattern. As fat intake increases, happiness score tends to increase as well. To confirm this, we calculated the Pearson correlation coefficient, which gave us a value of 0.69. This indicates a moderate positive correlation. So, overall, yes, higher long-term fat intake is associated with higher happiness levels.
Now let's move to question 18. Are countries with lower monthly nutrients variations happier? This is the table between estimate monthly nutrient variations and happiness score of different countries from the daily intake collections and happiness collections. As you can see, the happiness score fluctuates as estimate monthly nutrients variation increase. So it's very difficult to see a clear pattern of increasing or decreasing of happiness score when the estimate monthly nutrients variation increase. Therefore, I decided to make this illustration to show the correlation between monthly nutrients variations and happiness. As you clearly see, the trend line interpretations illustrate a downward trends, a negative correlations. Moving to the axis. For the y-axis, it represents the happiness score. The higher mean the happier. And then for the x-axis, it represents the estimate monthly nutrients variations, standard deviation things. So it has three main parts. The first one is the low values, which represent for the nutrient supply is steady. And the second part is in the middle, the moderate values, which is still a steady supply, but it has some occasional fluctuations. And for the last part is the high value. So this part represents for the unstable or inconsistent food system. So from this illustration, you can clearly see that the answer is yes. Countries with lower monthly variations are happier. Now, let's move to the next one.
So these are the questions that I'll be answering for question 19. So based on an article by the University of Michigan in 2011, the United States has about 7.52 fast food restaurants per 100,000 people, while a less wealthy country like Japan has only 0.13. Researchers also find that obesity rates in US men and women were about 31.3% and 33.2%, whereas in Japan, men and women contribute about 2.9% and 3.93% in the obesity rate. Further studies also shows that wealthier countries will report higher levels of happiness consistent with the findings of Otis Ospina and Rosser in 2017. This shows that richer nations tend to experience higher average life satisfaction. At the same time, we consider that these countries might also experience lower life expectancy due to health issues that are linked to processed food consumption. Research by Bahaduran, Mirmaran, and Azizi in 2016 supports this, noting that long-term consumptions of processed food can lead to obesity, insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular conditions. This led us to an initial assumption. Wealthier developed countries tend to have greater access to fast food establishments. The reasoning is that fast food chains generally thrive in these developed countries, where the population has higher disposable income and the infrastructure supports large commercial and food industries. Since these countries have more access to these food options, they tend to be much more happy and face more health problems. To test our assumption more systematically, we divided all countries' dataset into two, the above average and lower average GDP contribution. This allowed us to examine the differences between processed food intake versus unprocessed food intakes, the happiness level, and also the life expectancy of the country. Our results supported our assumption. Above average GDP contribution countries consume more processed food on average, while the below average countries consume more unprocessed foods such as vegetable proteins. We also find that average GDP contributed countries with higher levels of contribution reported higher happiness scores. This is likely due to higher quality of life and wider access to different kinds of food options, including fast food. However, one interesting and unexpected finding was that above average wealthier countries still had higher life expectancy. Even though they consume more processed food, this seems contradictory because processed food is often linked with health risks. However, we do believe that life expectancy depends on many other factors, and above average GDP countries tend to have better healthcare access, higher medical quality, improved sanitation, stronger social and welfare systems. These factors can significantly offset the negative effects of processed food consumption, explaining why life expectancy remains higher despite the dietary differences. In summary, while wealthier countries do consume more processed food and have greater access to fast food establishments, this doesn't automatically translate to worse health outcomes. Instead, broader social economic factors, particularly healthcare quality and even economic conditions, amongst many other that plays a huge and larger role in shaping overall happiness and health. Next, I'll pass my time over to the next person.
Okay, now I'll be presenting on whether fast food consumption increases health risks and how that risk can be mitigated. We analyzed menu data from McDonald's, Burger King, and Starbucks and compared their nutrient against WHO World Health Organization dietary guidelines. So first, the background and WHO guidelines. Fast food is convenient and widely consumed. It's often high in sodium, sugar, saturated fat, and trans fat. These nutrients are directly linked to obesity, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and type 2 diabetes. WHO recommends that less than 2,000 milligrams of sodium, 50 grams of sugar, 22 grams of saturated fat, and just 2 grams trans fat per day. So, we calculated how much of these limits each item contributes. So, these are our key findings. Our chart shows the average nutrient content per item for Burger King are significantly higher in calories, sodium, and saturated fat, while McDonald's items are slightly lower, but still exceeds the WHO thresholds. Further on, Starbucks items, while missing sodium and sugar data, show high fat density and very low fiber. Across all three chains, the pattern is clear: nutrient imbalance, high energy density, and poor dietary quality. So, what is our health risk interpretation? This means that a single fast food item, not a full meal, just one item, can consume 50 to 200% of your daily recommended intake for saturated fat, trans fat, or sodium. High sugar beverages and low fiber meals further increases the risk. Over time, this level of nutrient excess contributes directly to chronic diseases like heart diseases, diabetes, and obesity. This health risk is real, measurable, and widespread. So, what are the mitigation strategies? To reduce this risk, we need action at 3 levels. So, first is industry reformulation. Reduce sodium in processed items, eliminate industrial trans fats, and lower sugar in beverages and desserts. Next is transparent labeling. Show the percentage of WHO limits directly on menus. Flag calorie dense and low fiber items and empower consumers to make informed choices. Finally, government policy. Implement sugar taxes enforce trans fat bans, and set sodium reduction targets. These strategies have already worked in countries like Mexico, where a soda tax reduced consumption by 7.6%. So, in conclusion, fast food consumption significantly contributes to nutrient excess and chronic disease risks. But with reformulation, transparency, and policy, these risks are manageable. Aligning fast food menus with WHO guidance isn't just possible, it's essential for public health. Thank you. Now I'll pass my time to the next person.
Thank you. Move to question 21. Long-term dietary transitions for epidemiological analysis. Are there any notable nutrition shifts in the US, and what can be the expectations? So here's the table of the long-term changes of nutrients in the US between 1961 to 2022 from the daily intake collections. As you can see from this table, a substantial growth in the total calories driven primarily by fats. So fat is the dominant one, followed by the carbohydrates intakes, and then the protein intakes. Finally is the vegetable intake. This reflects a structural shift in the US food supply, marked by the increased popularities of processed food and egg oils. This pattern also aligns with the rising affluence and growing per capita meat consumptions. To have a clearer visualizations, I made the illustrations. As you can see, these four categories all are increased in the final year compared to the start year. To be more specific, I create the yearly change of nutrients in the US from a stimulated food intakes from 2015 to 2020 collections. As you can see, even though it's a yearly change, but in general pattern is still the same. So in general, there's a structural shift in the US food supply, marked by increased popularities of processed foods and egg oils. To have a better understanding about the reasons about this, let's move to the case studies. According to the US dietary data, it reveals a profound nutritional transitions characterized by a substantial increase in calorie intake, driven primarily by fat and secondarily by animal protein. This epidemiological shift can be attributed to three main factors. The first one is the availabilities. So food availabilities was transformed by the post-World War II development of ultra-processed foods and the fast food industry. So it increased in the total fat consumption. And the second one is the social change and healthcare. Even though these two are contradictory effects, but it still strongly correlates to this. And the last one is the wealth and preference. Socioeconomic factors such as rising disposable income are strongly correlated with increased consumptions of energy-dense foods, notably the animal protein. So, in general, the question is yes, and we can deeply understand the reasons behind it. Now let's move to the next part.
Okay, thank you. For question 22, we will be answering these questions. So for question 22, we analyze the monthly fat consumption. Assuming high fat intake is unhealthy, we explore the monthly averages and use these scores to identify the significant spikes. The global bar chart helped us identify the month with the highest overall fat intake. And as you can see from the bar chart, it seems that March is the highest month of fat intake. So moving on to the next slide for the country-specific highest months. When we looked at the individual countries, it was quite surprising as the highest fat consumption was in March, April, and February. But after more research, it made sense. For the US, March includes Mardi Gras, the Fat Tuesday known as a high-fat festival for foods. In Germany, Easter meals in March and April often include rich, fatty foods and dishes. In Japan, February is the coldest month, so people consume more calorie-dense fatty foods to stay warm. In Brazil, Carnival falls in February-March, bringing the rise in festive, high-fat foods. In India, this period overlaps with peak wedding season, meaning more elaborate, high-fat celebrations. So these cultural events explain why February, March, and April consistently show the highest fat consumption spikes, making them the ideal government awareness campaigns. Now moving on to the next slide, are there healthy fast food options available that can be promoted via public campaigns? Short answer, yes. When we looked at whether healthy fast food items exist, based on nutritional threshold for fat, sodium, cholesterol, and saturated fat, we found several items that quantify as healthier choices, meaning public campaigns can promote these options. So for food, these are the guidelines that we have followed, and these are the food items that can be bought from McDonald's that are healthy options. So now moving on to the next slide, healthy fast food options that can be introduced. So for beyond existing items, we explore possible healthy menu addition fast food chains can introduce. First, grilled lean protein burgers. These reduce total fat intake compared to fried alternatives. Second, offering alternatives such as fresh fruit cups or baked sweet potato fries, which add fiber, vitamins, and a lower glycemic impact. Third, high-fiber breakfast items like oatmeal bowls topped with nuts or fruits to provide sustained energy and satiety. However, many current healthy fast food items still lack the essential micronutrients needed for a balanced diet. These new options will help to fill those gaps while keeping meals convenient and affordable. They also offer the key nutritional benefits. They're low in saturated fats, high in fiber and nutrients from whole grains and vegetables, contain healthy unsaturated fats from avocado or olive oil, and use fresh, lower sodium ingredients compared to typically processed fast foods. So, in conclusion, the highest spikes in fat consumption occur in February, March, and April, mainly due to the seasonal and cultural events across countries. These months are the most effective period for increased public health messaging. At the same time, governments and fast food chains can promote existing healthy items and introduce nutrient-rich options to help consumers make better choices during these high-risk months. Thank you. I'll be passing my time over to the next person.
Thank you, Luca. So now I'll talk about question 23. So firstly, in this analysis, here are the assumptions made. So for the freedom score, since explicitly regulating sugar consumption involves stronger government intervention than employing implicit policies, we assume it correlates with the freedom score, where lower scores indicate a higher tendency toward explicit regulations. So SQL and NoSQL queries were used to combine the daily intake and happiness data sets, and Python scatter plots were used to analyze the relationships. Now let's take a look at the relationship. So firstly, for happiness versus average daily calories, we can see that higher happiness level clusters at moderate calorie intake. Very low intake is associated with low happiness, while extremely high intake does not lead to additional benefits. This suggests that balanced nutrition contributes most to subjective well-being. Next, let's look at the GDP per capita versus average daily calories. Similarly, you can see that moderate calorie intake is associated with higher GDP per capita, likely reflecting healthier and more productive populations. Very low intake corresponds to weaker economic performance. Next, let's look at the life expectancy versus average daily calories. A positive relationship is observed between calorie intake and life expectancy. Low intake leads to lower life expectancy due to undernutrition effects, while moderate intake corresponds to higher life expectancy. We can see that beyond a certain level, additional calories do not further improve health outcomes. Let's look at the first study by the National Library of Medicine. According to the study, we can see that both overconsumption and underconsumption of calories contribute to poor health outcomes. High calorie intake leads to the increases the risk of heart disease, hypertension, and stroke, while low calorie intake leads to malnutrition, impaired cognition, and potential eating disorders. Next, let's look at the freedom score versus the average daily calories. We can see that there is no clear trend between the freedom scores and calorie intakes, suggesting that stricter, more explicit policies do not necessarily produce better nutritional outcomes. Let's take a look at this study by the BMG. So this study highlights the strengths and weaknesses of policy intervention. Stricter measures such as sugar taxes can reduce harmful consumption but may disproportionately affect lower income population, reducing its overall effectiveness. Effective national strategies include coordinated approaches, including increased access to healthier foods, subsidies, incentives for fresh produce, and school meal programs. While public education campaigns can also be done by nutrition labeling, community workshops, and school programs. We can also use selective taxation and economic incentives, such as targeted taxes on sugary foods combined with subsidies or voucher. So these approaches ensure effectiveness while minimizing socioeconomic burden on vulnerable populations. So in conclusion, moderation is key. It's important to note that this analysis examines nutrition in isolation. In reality, many other factors such as healthcare access, income levels, and government stability also influence happiness, health, and economic outcomes. Countries with high fat or sugar intake should aim to reduce and moderate their calorie consumption, as balanced intake is associated with improving well-being across all three dimensions. Rather than relying solely on strict measures such as sugar taxes, the most effective national strategies combine implicit policies such as public education campaigns and improving access to healthier foods. This balanced approach maximizes public health benefits with minimizes unintended burdens on lower income populations. With that, I'd like to bring us to the end of this presentation.
Okay, 3, 2, 1.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.